Tenakoto katoa no Aotearoa o Tamaki Makaro Aho. Tenakoto katoa. Welcome everyone. Good morning. Today I'm going to talk about how things went wrong with the title When Twiddling the Dials Go Wrong. Before we get started, I would like to thank our sponsors. Without their massive support, all of this wouldn't have been possible. A little bit about me, what I do. My name is Shofe. Some of you might know me already. I'm a security consultant working at CyberCX. I've been working in the security industry for around 3 years, doing all sorts of pen testing, code reviews, and all the other things. I do like playing cricket, taking photographs when it's allowed to go outside, and also presenting like I'm doing now. You may also recognize me from Hack and Learn, a group of people that we organize CTFs. We used to do it monthly, and we recently did one in KawaiiCon. Thanks to people who have participated and also share the same interests that we do. Now, the elephant in the room. Why this talk, actually? I believe the picture says a lot. A lot of the client comes to us, and over the years, we looked at a bunch of applications and product stack that looked relatively secure at first, until you get to a point where you see something custom, something out of the blue, and you start to feel like, what were they even thinking when they were doing it? It's like they were trying to shoot themselves in the feet. This is the main theme of today's talk. I've laid it out in a way that we'll talk about some non-standard configuration, which led to some interesting bugs. We'll try to do some deep dive and see why these bugs happen and what sort of security implications they introduced, pretty much what went wrong, and then some takeaways for us. And while we are doing this, we'll have a look at two common frameworks in CMS. One is Umbraco, and other is Laravel, which is a PHP-based framework. To get things started, let's look at the first scenario. We'll look at two scenarios in total. First one is PHP Laravel. The client reached out to us, hey, can you test our application? Looked like that was heavily influenced by PHP Laravel. They went out of their way when we tested their product. It looked like they went out of their way to introduce some custom functionalities. We'll talk more about that in detail. That combined with lack of user input, sanitization, or any sort of validation, and we could remotely inject command and run commands on the web server in the backend. That's in short. Let's get more into details. So what does the application do and how it works? Imagine an event organization application. So you create events, you want people to follow, you want people to see your post, you put in content, people contribute, and then you organize an event after that. What was the driving factor on this application is it had functionalities to add images, you can add text, and the community can come in and comment and add their own contents. All these images that you upload over there or other contents that you upload gets uploaded in their own cloud storage, which was good and all. However, once we do the web application side of review, we try to focus on the file upload function because there's so many things that can go wrong. While we were doing that, we found that the users can upload files, they can manage, they can also delete the previous file so that they can upload a new one. This was good and all until we further inspected what's going on behind this delete function, and we realized they're using a HTTP delete method, which is not that common. It's possible to use it, but not that common. We felt it's quite interesting. You could have used post and then also get to remove the record for that file. Instead, you're using a delete. Why? maybe scratch that. Let's use delete. Let's have a look at the request itself. So we can see here, it looks similar to a post or get request where we are sending a delete with an identifier, in this case 12345, which is probably the name of the file. And we have that file key parameter, which seemed quite interesting once we looked at it at first. Could we change it to something else? Could we make it do something else? Could we delete another file that we do not have access to? Luckily for us, we had access to source, and this type of jobs, it makes it easier to understand what the app is trying to do when we are initiating a file delete command. This is how it looks like from the code perspective. Might be quite a lot if you're looking at it at the first time, but I would want you to focus on line 4, where you see a file key parameter is being used to construct a URL value as well. Then this URL value is taken and being used on the second to last line as a commandlet. We can see here curl is being used, which is unusual. Rather than using framework defined function, they are trying to use a system command, making a another delete request. And at the end, we can see the URL value is being appended at the end. If we look at the previous request again, we would see we can control this file key when we are sending the request. Could it be related? Could we take control over the file key and then append anything at the end of the URL? And whatever is in the URL gets executed straight away. And throughout this process, we have never noticed any sort of sanitization. User input sanitization is something you take invalid input or malicious input and you try to reduce the impact, or hey, you cannot do that, this is dangerous to do. Without any sorts of verification now, since we are running and passing these commands over to shell exec, which is a system level command, they just execute this. Whatever is inside, execute this one. This looked quite interesting. This could be an avenue where we could take our piece of string, hey, do this, run it. And since there is no verification, we might be able to run it. This is where you could think of injecting commands. For example, here, if you look at the file key param, things are looking different now. We are using bash to run a command called whoami, which returns the user we are running as in the web server. We see a response. However, this is not a response that we were looking for. Usually we would want a verbose response that tells us, hey, this is the user the web server is running as. Well, this is something. We at least know there is no checks performed. So it's not throwing out an error, it's just taking whatever we are giving it to execute and running and coming back to us. At least that's what we think for now. If you look at the bottom of the page now, from theory, this is what we expect it to do. It is running a curl command and you get the HTTPS hostname, and at the end, whatever we put in as a file key is appended. So far, looking good. However, if we cannot make it respond the way we want, what else could we do? We cannot see the output of a whoami command. So chances are now that we can do a pingback or DNS resolution, or maybe just straight up go for a shell. This is what you see once you land on a remote session on the web server. Let's take a moment to roll back and see what we did so far and what happened once we land on a shell. First, we took that URL parameter that gets used to construct a system command. And now we are saying, hey, take our command, give us a shell back, and we would want to interact with your system. So here we ran whoami, and we can see it's running as data. This is the standard low privilege user that Apache runs under. Once you run as that web server user, you have more privilege than you probably would have thought. For example, if you are using encryption values to encrypt your cookies, you could read that. You could exploit the source files and do a bunch of other stuff. You could ask yourself, hey, you guys had access to source, so that's unfair. How about a remote attacker coming in and landing on a shell on your system without access to source? Now they can download the information, download the source code and read and see how you have constructed your web application. And it only goes to introduce more security risk from here. If you have multi-host, multi-website in one host, they probably have access to those as well. So overall, we took user input from the URL. We did it, the devs weren't sanitizing the input. We were able to gain access to their web server and probably complete control over it. That's the first scenario. Let's move on to a different one. In this case, we're looking at a CMS. CMS means Content Management System. Umbraco is quite popular and widely used. It's something that you could think similar to WordPress or Drupal. Makes things easier for you. You can configure the front end and work as you want to, and you can rely on Umbraco to take care of the backend. In this case, we had a similar scenario where we noticed something unusual. We followed onto it, and then we realized Umbraco itself had some authorization checks issues. Authorization checks is where you're checking if the user is permitted to do the actions that they are trying to do. This ended up in resetting any user's password, which you could reset the admin user password as well. And once you take over the administrator account, you pretty much own the site. That's in short. Let's go to the extended version now. I would want you to look at the left side of your screen. I don't know if that's the left side for you as well. If you look here, you'll see 5 user group. And if you look at the right hand side, you'll see one more user group that sticks out. Once we first had a look at it, we couldn't actually figure out why this user role exists. And of course, this is a client configuration, and on the left is a default installation. As it turned out, you could actually create users. However, this user manager cannot create users with admin privilege. How about you just let the admin handle creation of users? We don't know. Client probably had a different motivation. We wanted to see, okay, so the user manager can create users, but can we create admin users? If we create, we don't actually see it. Let's try to see what else is there. What it looks like is Umbraco uses user ID parameter. For some of you, it might ring a bell now. Okay, can we change this 1 to 2? We'll come back to it. In a modern day, in an ideal situation, you would use a GUID, which is a random number of string that's unidentifiable, not easily identifiable. However, since they're using this, now we came to think where else they're using this. And can we change it to access any other user's profile? So we tried doing that. Unfortunately, it looks like an authorization check is in place. And in the bottom, we are requesting our own resource on profile, and it works. Let's have a look at here. There is quite a lot going on the screen. However, if you focus on the red mark, big red mark of box, you'd see this is what you see if you try to create a user from the user manager. Here, administrator user doesn't exist, especially the group. However, the request that goes in the backend, on the right hand side, we are using an intercepting proxy called burp suite. Burp suite lets us sit between the browser and the web server and lets us modify the request on the fly. So this is a request that you would typically see going back to the back office or the API. All we needed to do is add a string called admin into the JSON that Umbraco is sending over to the API. And there we go. We can create a user with administrator privilege, and we can verify going into it that it's part of administrator group. So that worked. And strangely enough, some part of the code has authorization checks, some doesn't. At this point, we were thinking, could it be that easy? This is a well-known CMS we are talking about. As it turned out, yes. And we discovered this issue because a non-standard configuration was in place and we tried to dig deep. At this point, if I were you, I would ask myself, what more can we do? We discovered we can change password for users, and that request also has a user ID parameter that we can tamper with. And here we go. We have successfully resetted password for a super admin. For those of you who are wondering, what's a super admin user? The first time you set up Umbraco, you're assigned with a user ID -1. That's supposed to be the super admin, has more privilege than an admin user. And in this request, we can see in the red box, we have changed the ID parameter to -1, and that's all we needed to do to change the super admin user password, and we can change it to whatever we want. So that led to complete takeover of the site, and we could now do whatever we want to with that website. At this point, I would usually do a demo. However, since the memory is still fresh, I would like to walk you through some code. I feel like there are some things we can take away from this. Umbraco was generous enough. You could download their source code, open these DLLs, and start tinkering around. Once we started doing that, we started noticing a pattern of how they check if the user is a super admin. So in this slide, you could see is super, which is checking if the user is super admin. In this slide, it's checking if the user is part of an admin group or if it's an admin user. The third one, if the user is not part of admin, certain part of the UI elements wouldn't be displayed. This matches with the description that we said the user manager cannot see any admin users, even though they exist. And ultimately, this is where the main culprit was. These are the two functions that we looked at. First is to create users. Second is to change user password. And in both instances, if you look at the code, you wouldn't see anywhere that it's checking for authorization. And as a normal authenticated user, you go in and it doesn't check if you have the permission to do this stuff, do these changes. We reported this to Umbraco. It turned out to be a 0-day as well. And what it looked like is Umbraco didn't know about it until we reported. We got assigned recognition as well as a fix. And the newer version of Umbraco, you would expect this bug to go away. Now I think it's a good time to do a short demo. I've prepared a video which I'll try to work through with this issue and how it impacts Umbraco. So if you look at the left-hand side of the screen, you'd see Umbraco. And on the right-hand side, it's Burp Suite Proxy, which lets us play around with the traffic. I'll start the video, and here we see we have a test admin user. And in another tab, I've opened User Manager 1, or the one with User Manager role that's not admin. The reason to do it is so that we can switch back and forth. Our first course of action would be to see if we can access any other user. So our user ID is 1 at the moment. We try to access -1, which is super admin. We get kicked out. which is understandable. Let's move on and see if we can tamper with the request goes into the backend. Sometimes the front end wouldn't allow you, but the backend would. So that's our next course of action. We try changing it to -1. And here we see the error message that we had seen earlier. Let's try to exploit those two functions that we previously talked about. We do know the user manager role can create users. So let's try to create a user with a dummy data, with some dummy data. And notice here the administrator group doesn't appear. Means in theory we cannot add an admin user. However, let's move on. Try two random values, and before we submit, press intercept. And here on the right hand side we can see how the request is constructed. And here it's defining under user groups, writer and editor. Nothing stops us from adding another value called admin and see what happens. We forward the request. Looks like the user has been created. Stop intercepting traffic. However, if we go back to user page, that user doesn't exist. As we discussed earlier, the admin user doesn't show up because the user manager doesn't have enough permission to see the admin users. However, let's log in as the admin user itself. And here we can see the user. If we want to confirm if it's part of administrator, we can see the group it has access to. So the admin user is created, and even though the front end says we can't, we could actually do it. Let's carry on and demonstrate the second issue we talked about, reset password issue. As we have said, we can change our password, but that can also trigger a password reset as well. Let's fill in the details. And once we go through this, send a request to the backend. Notice it's making use of new and old password. We have discovered another issue where you don't actually have to specify the old password. Just set it to null and you're good to go. Let's set the reset to true. So we are resetting the password for superadmin user who is stopping us from changing the ID value. Take a note of the password, send over this request, and it looks like it just went through fine. There was no checks performed. And now let's take a note of this. Let's get out of this user session, use this credential and see if something good happens. And here we go. Looks like we are logged in as a test admin. And to further test that we are indeed the super user, let's go into the user detail and -1. And since we are the user itself, we can access our own data. So that's two issues. First, we have gone in to exploit the user creation. Now we can create admin users as a normal user, as well as resetting password for the super admin and take over that account. At this point, you might be thinking, let's do a quick recap of what went wrong so far. We have talked about two scenarios, both Laravel and Umbraco. In the case of Laravel, it looked like even though the framework had secure coding options available and functionalities, the devs went out of their way to implement something that's relatively insecure and non-Laravel functionality. This combined with lack of user input validation, which is not checking if the user input is valid or does it have anything malicious. And if you combine that with a dangerous PHP function called shellexec, which is running commands on system level, you have a remote command injection and eventually taking over the entire website. You could talk about safer alternative in this place. If you have to use shellexec, you could pass them through escape shell CMD escape shell out. These are two built-in PHP functions as well. They try to make sure that whatever is coming from the user doesn't have anything dangerous that goes through the system shell exec. Let's look at Umbraco. We already talked about this. However, it looked like Umbraco had a custom user group, especially with the way client implemented shallow privilege separation. We didn't quite understand why they need that user. And also, if we think about the code, remember there were multiple ways to check if the user is super user, if the user belongs to admin group, if the user is admin itself. We believe that created some confusion in the code base, which led to some of this code base missing out on those authorization checks. Also, use of user ID and not a random UUID, or we call it GUID, a random string. All this combined with the lack of authorization checks, we could take over essentially the site that was built using Umbraco. Let's talk about some takeaways. We already talked about things went wrong, what led to all this, what we could do. Sometimes we feel like it may be easier, or you might save some time doing things in a different way. You go out of your way to write a function just to fix a problem now. However, consider the security implications you'll have down the line. There is a product you're building and that will serve the customers over time or you over time, and it might come back to haunt you because you're doing something to save time now. If you're really unsure, you can follow the framework specific guidelines. For example, Laravel and Umbraco CMS has detailed guidelines for developers about how things work and how to do things in a secure manner and how to lock down your system. Those could be a good starting place. Also, if you have a process to check for non-standard configuration before you deploy them to production, for example, you want to do something custom, that's fine. However, run it through rigorous checks before you deploy to production to iron out those bugs, rather than I write something custom, let's deploy to production and forget about it. And finally, it's really easy to make assumptions of how things work, especially with big CMS like Umbraco, where there are a multitude of functions, and we could only focus at certain functions at a time. As it looked like it was an underlying issue in Umbraco, and we didn't get to know until we reported, and Umbraco got back to us saying, hey, we have fixed it. So things like user permission checks and authorization checks are not easy to handle, and not easy to get right across the entire application stack. So it would help if you stop making assumptions and follow the guidelines they have. And in that client's case, they could have easily avoided the entire issue by specifying an admin user to handle the users. And finally, thank you for listening. Also, it was quite unfortunate. I wanted to be there, couldn't be there. However, my colleagues will be outside if you want to have a chat with them. If you also want to work with us, we are an awesome team. We do quite a lot of stuff, especially source code reviews. It's just bread and butter. Please reach out to us if you have any questions. Also, you can reach out to me in Twitter and with my Twitter handle. And thanks for listening.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Shofe. I hope everyone got the full benefit of that, given our late start. We don't have time for Q&A, I'm afraid, so we're going to have to jump straight into the next talk. If anyone has any questions for Shofe, please do reach out to him. And he is on the Hoover app as well if you want to speak to him right now online. Thanks again, Shofe.
Thank you. It was great talking here. Bye.